Okay, so this week we're going to look at some things, some events, some political and really kind of economic events that lead to the outbreak of the Civil War. By the end of this session today, we are definitely going to look at which states seceded first and why, and some people that kind of led to that. And then next week we'll look at the actual Civil War and those events. So just a few reminders. Make sure you are doing, for the bridge classes, make sure you're doing the discussion questions. I actually posted those today, so they're on my website already and in Remind. And make sure you guys are, if you have any questions, that you're letting me know that you have those. Also, some people have been replying all to everyone. Make sure you just hit reply just to me, and that's the single arrow instead of the double arrow there. So those are just a few reminders for you as we're going through. I'm coming to you from a back porch today. I needed a little change of scenery. So if you hear some cars driving by, things like that, that's what it is. So we're going to look at the 1850s and really into the 1860s, a little bit before, on the road to the Civil War. There is a note taker. If you want it, you don't have to do it. It's just kind of something to help you as we're going along. So we do have some problems during this time period, what we call sectional imbalance, meaning the different sections, the different parts of the country, they are really divided over their views on slavery. They're really divided on power. Everybody wants a balance of power in the Senate, specifically, remember, because they're everybody has equal representation in the Senate. So if there are more free states than slave states at this point, that would mean one group or the other has more power, and nobody wanted that. In 1850, California decides that they want to become a state, and California wants to enter as a free state. So this threatens the balance of free states versus slave states in the Senate. And with this, California wanted to be a free state. This would cause free states to have more power. So obviously your southern states that have slavery, they don't want that to happen. They don't want your free states to have more power than them. So they are super unhappy. So what they start to do, even in 1850, we're talking 10 years before the Civil War breaks out, Southerners already start to threaten secession. Obviously, too, it's not the first time because we've talked about it a few times in our class before. You also have some issues, a lot of issues now with the Underground Railroad becoming very popular, where people are escaping to their freedom, and then you call those people fugitive slaves. They're running to their freedom. They're going as far north as they possibly can, sometimes Canada. So now your Southerners that own these slaves are starting to look at this as a personal liberty issue of, just because a slave steps into a state that is free, does that mean that they're free? And in the eyes of the Southerners, they obviously didn't believe that. They wanted what they considered their property back. And so there is a big push to protect the rights of those Southerners and their property, which happened to be they viewed as property, but it was people. So there's a huge, again, last week we talked about mind shifts of the rights of people and things like that. And so that is definitely coming to the forefront politically. We talked about it socially, but politically, what does that look like in the United States? Remember, as I'm going through, if you have questions, make sure that you ask those. You can put those in the chat so that I can answer those questions for you. If you need me to repeat anything or go back, also let me know. Okay, so in order to kind of make everybody happy, you have some members of Congress that start to that start to come up with some ideas to do that. So Henry Clay, good old Henry Clay, I like to call him the crypt keeper. He was around for a really, really long time in politics, really around and, until during the Civil War. But he comes up with something called the Compromise of 1850. So we're in box number 2 right here. But he believed that the compromise would be a way to end the argument over slavery, that it would be a way to keep everybody happy, and then the country could just kind of move on. There would be no worries about the imbalance of the imbalance in the Senate of free states versus slave states, because it would already be taken care of and there would be no argument. And so he suggests, again, what we call the Compromise of 1850, obviously in 1850. He says California would enter as a free state, but then the rest of the territory of the United States, so we're talking all that area kind of out west. Remember, this is right around the time of the gold rush. So you do have a lot of people moving out west, so we know that there will be more states that are coming soon. He is saying there's not going to be any limits to slavery. You can have slavery or not in those new territories, but it's already been decided. You can have slavery, but you don't have to. He's not saying they have to. He also talks about the issue of those fugitive slaves that I was talking about, those people who were escaping north. That's my kitty cat, if you heard her. That were escaping north to their freedom. And so the Fugitive Slave Act also gets put into place. So box 3 with the Fugitive Slave Act says that escaped slaves could be taken from the north back to the south, back to their slave owners. And so that begins to happen, and anyone who helped a slave could be fined or jailed. So if you were caught helping someone on the Underground Railroad, or you were just caught helping, someone in general escape from slavery, you would either have to pay money or you would go to jail for that. Probably the number of times you were caught would depend on what your punishment would be. And so there were that became a big issue between, the North and the South and things like that. So that's what the Compromise of 1850 did. The problem with the Compromise of 1850, here's a map looking at it. The unorganized territory, Utah Territory, New Mexico Territory, Oregon Territory, all of those, anywhere where you see territory, all that area, they were really looking at, what to do with that area. Even though they're all kind of labeled here at this point, what the Compromise of 1850 was going to do was take all of those labels, except for California, all of those labels, take those labels off. And then you could have slavery or you didn't have to. It would just kind of be decided as they went. So, but the problem with the Compromise of 1850 is that really it was only temporary. It was not something that was going to fix slavery forever, because what happens when you get to the point of, say Utah wanting to become a state, and they don't want slavery, and that still creates an imbalance. It doesn't get rid of the possibility of that imbalance happening in the Senate. It just kind of makes everybody happy for the time being in 1850. So the compromise is passed, but people are happy, but not for a super long time. It's not very long before we have to deal with this issue again. At the same time that's happening politically, socially, you have kind of this blow up in the country. Remember last week we talked about how education changed. More people were able to get schooling, which meant more people could read and write, which meant more people were getting books and reading newspapers or writing books and things like that. Well, one of the most popular books during this time period was a book called Uncle Tom's Cabin, and it's by Harriet Beecher Stowe. I'll show you a picture of her in just a second. But what this book did is this book showed slavery as cruel and evil. Harriet Beecher Stowe, what she did is she went to the South and she lived with a family on a plantation that had slaves, and she kind of studied and she listened and she observed what was happening on this plantation. And so she wrote a book, and fictional book, but very, very real stories. And it was named Uncle Tom's Cabin during this time period. Well, even now, the term Uncle Tom is a derogatory term. It's a very negative term that you should never use. You don't need to say this to anybody ever. But the idea was that if you were an African-American, you were enslaved African-American, you were called an Uncle Tom, that meant basically that you were a sellout, that you would you would sell out your family, or you would sell out anyone that you loved in order for you to get personal gain with the white people, essentially. And so the story follows a character that is labeled that. I've never read it. I've tried to start reading the book, but it's definitely written in the language of 1852. I have it on my Kindle. I think it's one of those that at one point it was like free on Amazon. But it's a very, very hard read. But what it did, though, is it really brought the realness of slavery to the forefront for people to see. It was a bestseller. It sold 300,000 copies in the first year, and in 10 years it sold 2 million copies. So it was a really good selling book. Again, it just really opened the eyes socially of people to slavery, which played a role in all of those reforms that we talked about last week. So it really fueled the fire for the abolitionist movement, and the fact that a woman wrote it really kind of helped bring women to the forefront as well, for that women's rights movement. But it really put a light on the abolitionist movement as well. Abraham Lincoln actually met her a little bit after the Civil War started, and it's kind of like no one knows for sure if these are his exact words, but Abraham Lincoln said, so this is the lady who started the Civil War. She wrote the book in 1852, and it really, changed the minds or enlightened a lot of people on slavery. So he jokingly said, this is the woman that started the Civil War. She didn't really start the Civil War. Obviously, we know that. But because of her book, a lot of people's minds changed on slavery. Okay, remember, as I'm talking, you can ask questions in the chat if you need to. I'm here to answer those questions. Okay, so that's happening socially. Politically, during this time period, during the 1850s, you have a lot of new political parties that are forming. One of those new political parties is called the American Party, or as some people like to call them, the Know-Nothings. So the Know-Nothings were nativists, meaning they were all about people who were just born in, America, which is kind of funny because if you think about it, our background, our heritage of America is that everybody comes from all over, right? We're this melting pot or tossed salad, however you want to look at it, right? So our cultures, our backgrounds, they're all different, and that's just kind of what makes America super unique. They were anti-Catholic. They were really focused on, the reason, Protestantism. What brought a lot of people to America was their wanting to have their religious freedom, right? Even Catholics, but more so larger groups that moved here were those Protestant groups. Remember, Protestant, not Catholic. Anti-immigrant, obviously, if they're not from here, then they wouldn't want, the know-nothings wouldn't want those people here. And in a sense, just an easy way to put it, they were anti anyone who was not American. And the whole reason that this political party formed was so that they could, it's kind of funny, not really funny, was so that they could vote the opposite on like critical issues. So they wanted to vote the opposite of what how the majority was voting on critical issues, just so they could mess things up. So if Republicans and Democrats were voting one way, which not the Republicans, they weren't technically a party yet, but if the Democrats were voting one way, the American Party would try and get enough people to vote the opposite way, just so certain things maybe couldn't happen, especially things that they didn't feel like fit their platform, which is right here. Another new political party was the Free Soil Party. So looking at the presidential election of 1852, you have three big candidates. I say three big candidates. You have your two big political parties of the time period. You have the Democrats. Their candidate was Franklin Pierce right there. And his platform as he's running for president is he wants to expand the United States. He is carrying on that idea of manifest destiny. It's our destiny to have land from the Atlantic to the Pacific, and he just wants to keep expanding, right? He wants more states, he wants more land, all of that. So that's his platform. He does not address slavery. And the other political party, the big party of the time period, is the Whig Party and General Winfield Scott. He was a War of 1812 veteran, and the votes of the Whig Party were split over slavery. I can't remember General Scott's stance on slavery. I don't remember if he even said anything about it. But he did not win because the Whig vote was split over slavery. The Whig Party could not agree. So obviously, if everybody's not putting their votes behind the same person, it's not going to go very well for them. And then the last person, this was a new political party here. John Parker Hale was part of the Free Soil Party. And the Free Soil Party, their motto, their platform really was free soil, free speech, free men. So their stance was no slavery. They were anti-slavery. They wanted to get rid of slavery if they could, which sounds like a really great idea. But we have to look at what year it is. It's 1852. Taking a stance on slavery in 1852, whether it be, extremely for it or extremely against it, politically was not good for you. You should not, really what happens is Franklin Pierce, he just doesn't address slavery. And so because he doesn't do that, like he doesn't ruffle feathers of people, he doesn't, make people uncomfortable in any way with it. And so people vote for him. Around this time in the early 1850s, people just kind of ignore arguing about, people will ignore or will argue about slavery like friend to friend, but politically you don't argue about slavery, because if you're taking a stance on something kind of so controversial, you are either going to, you're just not going to get a lot of votes, because you're going to, make one side, more upset than another side. So just not talking about it was the way to go politically. And so people just kind of ignored this idea about slavery until they couldn't ignore it anymore. And we'll get to that today. So here are your election results. Really, it was a huge landslide for the Democrats, for Franklin Pierce. So he becomes president, and we're just going to kind of move forward a little bit. Again, a lot of people just kind of ignore slavery. They ignore it until they can't ignore it. In 1852, partway through Franklin Pierce's presidency, you have the Kansas-Nebraska Act formed. And so it's introduced by a man named Stephen A. Douglas. We'll talk about him more in just a second. But the territories of Kansas and Nebraska were wanting to organize to become states. And so with the Missouri Compromise, both would have been free under that compromise, because basically everything above Missouri would be free, everything below would be that's the Kansas-Nebraska Act. But under the Missouri Compromise, both Kansas and Nebraska would be free states. So obviously, what does this do to your southern states? It makes them upset, because now there's going to be more free states than slave states. And so free states would have more power. So what Stephen A. Douglas does to kind of make everybody happy, he says, okay, how about people vote to be a free state or a slave state? So he's bringing back this idea of popular sovereignty. Remember, power to the people. Power lies with the people in our government. So why don't we let the people who live in those territories decide what they would like to do? So Stephen A. Douglas introduces that, and here's what our map looks like. So the Missouri Compromise from way back in the day, the Missouri Compromise says everything below basically the southern border of Missouri, this black line right here, right? Everything below that line, moving forward, everything's going to be slave. Everything above it is going to be free. So Kansas and Nebraska here, they are technically, under this Missouri Compromise, they are technically free territory. But what Stephen A. Douglas says under the Kansas-Nebraska Act says, hey, let's just let them vote. Let them vote, and they can decide what they want to be. So that gets passed, and so the people are pretty excited. Most people in Kansas, they want to be a free state, right? Most people want to be free, but you do have these people in Missouri who are supporters of slavery that don't want Kansas to be a free state. They want slave states to have power and there be a balance in the free and slave states. So what happens at this point really kind of starts the ball rolling very quickly towards the outbreak of the Civil War. You have events called the Bleeding Kansas events. Newspapers name these events Bleeding Kansas. Over here on this side of the map, you see there are several attacks made by pro-slavery forces from Missouri into Kansas, where they attack these anti-slavery groups, and one of your more known ones is in Lawrence, Kansas in 1856. So what happens is supporters of both sides, they go to vote. Border ruffians, these people here, these are pro-slavery Missourians. They are the ones that, live right near the border. They go over into Kansas and they vote in Kansas in their election to decide whether or not Kansas is going to be a free state or slave state. So these border ruffians, not only do they attack your anti-slavery groups, but they also go into Kansas and vote illegally. So the results show up. The results come out, and the results are 6,000 people voted in Kansas. But the funny part here is there are only 1,500 people in Kansas who can actually vote. So how does that work? You have 6,000 people who voted, but only 1,500 people who can actually legally vote. Well, that's where those border ruffians have come in. So what ends up happening is Kansas does become a slave state. And like I said, in May of 1856, you have slavery supporters attack anti-slavery supporters in Kansas. Not that your anti-slavery groups were completely innocent. They also had their part in small attacks as well on slavery groups, mostly in retaliation for things that your pro-slavery groups were doing. But in these attacks in Lawrence, Kansas, there were about 50 deaths. Now, this attack in Lawrence is really what makes the headlines. This is what gets people's attention, especially people in Congress. So if you're following along in your note taker, there is a story here about two congressmen that really don't behave themselves in a way that you would think congressmen would behave themselves. So you have Senator Charles Sumner and Representative Preston Brooks that end up getting into a little argument, I guess you could say. So Charles Sumner, he was an abolitionist. He was, after hearing the events about Bleeding Kansas, he writes a speech called The Crime Against Kansas. And basically what he does is he kind of calls people out like people do on Twitter or Instagram or whatever, where they, will blast people so everyone can hear it. So that's what he does. He calls the people who were supporters of these border ruffians or supporters of these pro-slavery groups, he calls them murderous robbers from Missouri, and calling them other unthinkable names during the time period, scoundrel, different things like that, right? So he gives this speech, I believe it lasts 2 days, and he specifically calls out Andrew Butler of South Carolina, another senator, calling him an imbecile, and said that he had chosen a mistress, and I mean the harlot of slavery. Basically, he's saying that he is one of the biggest supporters of slavery, and how could you ever do that politically? It's wrong, this and that, okay? The problem here is that Andrew Butler is not there, but his nephew, Preston Brooks, is there. So Preston Brooks is sitting here listening to Charles Sumner, talk smack about his uncle. And so during this time period, it's a very much a big part of culture, especially kind of if you're higher up in society, to defend your family. And so Preston Brooks is like, this guy is not going to talk about my uncle like this, my older uncle. He's not going to talk about him like this. It's not fair. It's not right. And I'm going to take care of it. So a couple days after Charles Sumner's speech is over, Preston Brooks quietly sneaks into the Senate chambers where Sumner is working, and he takes his cane and he just starts whacking him over the head with it. He is literally sitting at his desk writing, and all of a sudden he gets smacked in the head. And he starts beating him so much. There were witnesses that said it sounded like Charles Sumner was like a calf that was like bellowing for its mother kind of thing. So what ends up happening is Preston Brooks is fined $300, which back then's a lot of money. I would take $300 though. He resigns from his post as a representative. He goes back home to South Carolina, but then he's reelected to the same seat. People in South Carolina were like, yeah, you should have done that. We're so proud of you. While others, obviously people, not from South Carolina may not necessarily have been okay with it. Sumner was hurt so badly that his seat sat empty for a couple years. Eventually he was reelected and he was able to return to work as well. But you literally have grown men who have been voted in to run the country that are, well, one man is beating another with a cane. So that's not the kind of behavior that we see today. People more so fight with their words today and not necessarily hitting each other with canes. But again, this is all because of what's happening in Kansas, where you have a Massachusetts senator and a Democratic representative that are fighting over what's happening in Kansas. And so, again, the ball just kind of keeps on rolling from there. Out of this as well, we do get another political party. This new political party is one that is very much so that you're probably familiar with, and this is the birth of the Republican Party that we have today. It was a mixture of Northern Whigs and Northern Democrats, as well as some Free Soilers and some Know-Nothings and other kind of opponents of the Kansas-Nebraska Act. And the Republican Party really does gain steam, gain popularity through the Bleeding Kansas events. The Republican Party, their stance was to end slavery. They did not want people to be able to vote yes or no. They just wanted slavery to be done. They wanted to end slavery, and this became really a more popular view during this time period because of the events like Kansas and things like that. So the Republican Party does form through these events. In 1854 is the first time, we see the Republican Party emerge. Now, it will be a while before they're able to gain enough steam to have a representative to be president, but we'll get to that in a few minutes. Okay, so another kind of social happening during this time period is the Dred Scott versus Sanford case in 1857. So you have a man, his name is Dred Scott here. He was a slave, and he believed he worked for a doctor, and he and his doctor had a very good relationship. He was really treated very, very well. And he got to the point where he said, I want to keep working, but I would like to get paid. And because of the relationship that he had with his slave owner, he wanted to kind of seek out freedom for himself, but also try and set a precedent for others as well. He believed that living in a free state and a free territory made him free, even though he was born into slavery. He also believed that the Missouri Compromise was unconstitutional, and basically he was suing for his freedom because technically he did live in a free state, even though he was born into slavery. So he's saying, I want to sue for my freedom. And so what he does is his case goes all the way up to the U.S. Supreme Court. And the case does not go as Dred Scott would like for it to go. His justification of living in a free state meant that he could be a free man was not what the justices of the U.S. Supreme Court shared. 7 of the 9 justices all wrote opinions where they said he should remain a slave. The Chief Justice of Supreme Court, in his opinion that he wrote on the case, he said, and this was the wording of the time period, he said, Negroes were not citizens, and therefore they could not sue in court. Remember, this is before the Civil War, so this is before the 13th Amendment. This is before the 14th Amendment, which grants citizenship, and before the 15th Amendment that grants voting rights to African American men. So basically, Chief Justice Taney says he's not a citizen, so technically he doesn't have the right to sue in court, so he just wasted all of his time. Taney was very torn up from this case, that eventually what he does because of this, he actually frees his own slaves. He completely believed that Dred Scott should be free, but the job of a Chief Justice is not to go by your personal feelings, it's to go by what the law says. And so he was trying to do his job by what the Constitution said, and this is pre, African Americans, having those rights. And so that's what his opinion was written on. So, but Chief Justice Roger Taney does end up freeing his, I don't know how many slaves he has, but he does end up freeing his own slaves after this case happens, because it just hit him so hard personally. But this does really bring to the forefront, like, what are the rights of African Americans that are free? Like, what does that look like? And how does the process of becoming free look like? And so, again, it's just really brought to the forefront, where you start to have more and more people fighting for those rights for African Americans. All right, the next part we're going to look at is 1858. You have an Illinois State Senate race between a newcomer, Abraham Lincoln, and Stephen A. Douglas, which we've talked about, a few minutes ago. So Stephen A. Douglas, he is running for an Illinois Senate seat. He and newcomer Abraham Lincoln are really going back and forth on a lot of issues. And obviously in 1858, we're getting really close to the Civil War breaking out. The idea of slavery, the subject of slavery, is not as unpopular to talk about, and it's really coming up more and more because of Bleeding Kansas, because of what happened with Sumner and Brooks and the Senate and things like that. And so this congressional election year, Stephen A. Douglas is the incumbent. He's running for re-election, and then you have this newcomer that really nobody knows anything about, in Abraham Lincoln of the Republican Party. He was a lawyer. He taught himself how to be a lawyer. He didn't go to college. He believed that there was no easy way to eliminate slavery, but that you could keep it from spreading. And so that's what he wanted to do. His stance on slavery was, you can't really, it's not easy to eliminate it, but you can stop slavery from spreading where it already is. So in a sense, he wasn't saying, I'm not trying to take slavery away from you. Let's just, move forward without slavery in these new territories. Now, Stephen A. Douglas, what he believed was unpopular sovereignty. He believed that people should decide what to do with slavery. Again, this idea of popular sovereignty. Let the people vote. I'm not going to tell you what to do, right? So he's trying to play on this idea of, like, I'm not like other politicians. I'm not going to tell you what to do. You are the people. You give power to this government. You're the reason I'm here. So I'm going to let you decide if you want slavery or not. I'm not going to try and keep it from spreading. I'm not going to try and eliminate it. You do you. Again, Lincoln says we can't stop it, but we can keep it from spreading. Stephen A. Douglas, that idea he calls the Freeport Doctrine. He runs on this. He's known as what people call the Little Giant. He was a little shorter probably than most men during that time period. And he says with the Freeport Doctrine, he says, popular sovereignty. If you live in a state or a territory that wants to get rid of slavery, you can legally exclude slavery by refusing to give rights to slave owners. So what he's saying is there's kind of like a loophole. If you're wanting to eliminate slavery, just change some of your laws in your state, and then the slave owners won't have as much power. This idea lost him support in the South, as a politician, which would make a difference later in a couple years from then when Stephen A. Douglas runs for president. It loses him supporters in the South because obviously they're slave owners and they want to maintain their rights. During this election, Douglas actually kind of tries to mudsling Lincoln in a sense of, claiming that Lincoln wanted equal rights or wanted equality for whites and African Americans. And because he was unknown and people just didn't really know like where he stood on a lot of issues because he hadn't had a lot of political experience, Lincoln loses narrowly, but he does start to gain this national reputation, and the Republican Party really grabs a hold of that and looks at him as someone that they could really get behind in the 1860 election. Before the 1860 election happens, though, you do have a response by an abolitionist. His name is John Brown. You do have a response to to pro-slavery groups by an abolitionist named John Brown. John Brown, he was known for going into Kansas and attacking pro-slavery groups and kind of like these small like hit and run attacks. And he eventually, what he decides to do is he decides that he wants to start a slave revolution. And he figured the best way he could start a slave revolution was to arm them. And the way to arm them was to steal weapons from the government and then give them to the slaves and start this revolt in the South. So he makes a plan in 1859 to raid the Harper's Ferry Arsenal in Virginia. He believes that he's going to have hundreds of men show up to help him, and that this is going to be the greatest raid, that no one's going to be able to stop it. There's not going to be any issue. So the morning, and John Brown too, I want you to think about John Brown as a man that has like plan A and that's it. There's only plan A. If something goes wrong, we're still sticking to plan A. He is all or nothing, 0 to 60. He is very polarizing in history in a sense, and we'll talk about that in just a second. So he believes hundreds of men are going to come and show up to this raid. He gets there very, very early in the morning, and only 18 people show up. And of those 18 people, 5 of them are his own sons, right? So his family makes up a third of the people who actually come to raid this arsenal to get those weapons. The raid is put down very quickly, and John Brown is actually caught, and he is sentenced to death by hanging. And he's killed in December of 1859. I believe, I can't remember if all of his sons died, but at least several of his sons did die in the raid. It was put down very quickly by nearby citizens in that area. And you had a lot of differing views on John Brown. Like, was he a crazy person? Or was he a hero and a martyr? Like, was he this, extremist, domestic terrorist, which a lot of people in the South viewed him as a terrorist. But a lot of people in the North viewed him as, this martyr. A martyr is someone who dies for a cause. And him putting his life on the line there to, possibly get caught during this raid, and then he does. He was okay to die for what he believed in. And so, being from Kansas, there eventually was a mural that was put up in the 1900s, of him, as like a leader, of him as like conquering, slavery, things like that. So he is polarizing. It's really interesting to hear. I wish we were in class because I would love to hear, your views on him. But I want you to go back and watch the video that's in here. I think I put it in your packet as well, but watch those videos that are in the packet because it really gives more information there for you. Again, some people in the North viewed John Brown as a crazy person. Some people viewed him as a martyr, someone dying for that cause. And the South definitely viewed him as a terrorist, definitely viewed him as an enemy. All right, so that happens in 1859. 1860 is we're kind of going backwards here, I guess. 1856 election, the Democrats win again, James Buchanan here. You do have the Republicans put in a candidate John C. Fremont, he doesn't do well. The Whigs are still around as well. But again, this is the time period. The Republicans are new. The Whigs are falling apart. Nothing really happens from the 1856 election. So I just kind of skip over that. Those are the results there. Buchanan wins. John C. Fremont makes an okay showing, but not enough to really, do much for the Republicans. But they do have 4 years to figure out what they're going to do. So here is the election of 1860. You have 4 different candidates. And the reason for that is your Democratic Party for the 1860 election, your Democratic Party starts to split, right? We still have our Democratic Party today, but they kind of go through a really hard time during the Civil War. You have the Constitutional Union Party there. You have this new Republican Party. It's their their second showing, and they are, they have this new guy, Abraham Lincoln, who his stance on slavery was, I'm not going to stop it, but I'm going to try not to let it spread. I don't want to take your rights away from you. And your Southerners were not okay with that. Your Southerners did not trust Abraham Lincoln as far as they could throw him. And your Northern Democrats, those are the ones that didn't support slavery. And they supported Stephen A. Douglas. So 1860 was kind of like redemption for Abraham Lincoln. Could he this time beat Stephen A. Douglas? And then your Southern Democrats had John C. Breckinridge, obviously someone who supported slavery. But with this, just kind of looking at this, we know Abraham Lincoln wins. But looking at the Democrats being split, that is a huge issue because they couldn't back one candidate. If the Democrats had been able to back one candidate, then this election might have looked a lot different. Abraham Lincoln might not have been elected. You might not have had states secede. It just would have probably looked a lot different than the way things played out. The official stance or the official results, basically what happens, Lincoln, he's with the new Republican Party. The South says, if Lincoln wins, we're out. We are seceding. We are not doing this. We are going to make our own country. We do not trust Lincoln. And because slavery split the Democratic Party, that helps Lincoln win. And so now our country kind of has to scramble a little bit because was the South joking? Are they really going to secede? Are they really going to leave? Nobody really, knows at this point. If we were in class, we would do this activity, but I am going to tell you a little story about this document. Florida was one of those southern states that said, if Lincoln's elected, we are, or not Lincoln specifically, but they do say if a northern president is elected, that Florida will secede. And this document here, it's written to other governors throughout the South that says basically we're all in this together and we are going to support you. So Florida, in this time period, they are all for supporting slavery. They're all for supporting secession, and that they would be right there with everyone, standing hand in hand, getting that there. So this leads to a lot of different kind of social factors. People kind of have to decide, are they going to be with their government or are they going to be against their government? I invite you to go kind of look at that document. If you want to read it, it's pretty cool. Again, we would have done an activity together had we been in class. The Republican platform of slavery in this time period is kind of a mixture of a bunch of the other early political parties that we've talked about. They believe in non-extension of slavery for your free soilers, right? Free speech, free soil, free men. They want a protective tariff for northern industrialists, right? You want to protect that industry in the north for them. They also want, basically, they don't want to limit the rights of immigrants just because they're not from the United States. And remember the Know-Nothings, the American Party, they were nativist. They didn't like anybody who wasn't from America. And so that was kind of a disappointment to them. They wanted government aid to build a Pacific Railroad, basically for the Northwest. They wanted to start kind of industrializing the West as much as they could. And then basically just internal improvements in general for the West that the federal government would pay for, just so, the advancement of growth for the country, things like that. So that's the Republican Party platform. The biggest part, though, we're talking, 1860, the end of the 1850s, people are now openly talking about slavery, taking stances on slavery, although Lincoln's was kind of, his was really kind of moderate, right? He wasn't saying no slavery. He wasn't saying yes slavery. He was just saying, why don't we just leave things how they are? As far as slavery goes, and it just not expand. You keep it, we're just not going to expand it anywhere else. And that just didn't sit right a lot with the South. Again, like I said, they did not trust Abraham Lincoln. So the results, or the election, what it's doing is really, this picture shows it best. It is really tearing the nation apart. You have your 4 different candidates here with a map of the country that's just being torn into pieces by the different areas. And so that's really a representation of how the people felt as well. But because one of your 2 major political parties could not make a decision on who they wanted their candidate to be, that allowed for the Republicans and Abraham Lincoln to swoop in there and win. So Lincoln gets the majority of those electoral votes. And so there's your map there with that. The Constitutional Union, they have a pretty good showing. Your Northern Democrats, not so much, because most of your Northern people who probably would have been Northern Democrats, they voted for Abraham Lincoln. So, and obviously your Southern states there, they stuck with their, most of them stuck with the Southern Democrat, John C. Breckinridge. So Lincoln wins in a landslide. So now, was the South really serious about seceding? Well, yeah. And so you have someone named John Crittenden, who's a know-nothing from Kentucky, that decides he is going to do one last attempt to keep the South from seceding. So on December 18th, 1860, the Crittenden Compromise is proposed in Congress. And basically what he says is, if the president and Southern states can agree to this, then it will be fine. And so Crittenden says, let's protect slavery south of Missouri. So it's kind of like going back to the Missouri Compromise, where everything below the border of Missouri would be slave, everything above would be free. And Lincoln didn't like this. Lincoln's like, no, we're not, like, slavery is not going to expand at all. We're just not going to touch it where it already exists, and that's it. And because Lincoln did not agree with this, the South said that they're going to secede because they didn't feel like Lincoln had their interests in mind. They felt like he was only going to look out for your northern industrial states and not your southern, more agricultural states, and so they didn't trust him. So 2 days later, South Carolina is the first state to secede. Because nobody could agree, nobody could, come to that decision, South Carolina says, we're out. So South Carolina there is the first to secede, and they believed that they were justified in doing this through states' rights. They said, we entered the Union, on our own accord. We made our own decision to do that, so we can also leave on our own accord. It's our right to do that. The 10th Amendment is states' rights, and so they were using the Constitution that they now were no longer a part of that country anyway to justify seceding and breaking off. So they do that. After the new year, Mississippi's next. Florida is the third state to secede from the Union on January 10th, 1861. Followed by Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, and then Texas. Now, During that time period in April of 1861, you have an event. You have an attack on a federal fort in Fort Sumter in South Carolina off the coast of Charleston. After that is over, you have 4 more states secede, and those are those states in pink. The states in orange, Missouri, Kentucky, Maryland, Delaware, West Virginia, I'm not going to count there because it technically didn't become a state until 1863, but West Virginia broke off from Virginia because they didn't want to secede, and so they were able to create their own state there. But those events at Fort Sumter caused more states to secede because of what Lincoln does after the events are over. So Lincoln, knowing that these southern states are seceding, he doesn't think that that this is going to last very long. He doesn't necessarily think there's going to be a war. He's preparing, but he says, all of our military forts, all of the U.S. military forts that are in the South, we are going to hold all of our property. Those forts do not belong to the southern states or the rebellious states. I think he referred to them a lot. But the South says, it's in our land, it's our territory. And so what ends up happening is Lincoln wants to send supplies to Fort Sumter in South Carolina. That is a picture right there of Fort Sumter on the bottom right. But he wants to get, he pleads with the South, for reconciliation. Let's talk about this. Let's get things together. They don't want to listen to him. He wants to send supplies to his people in the fort. The South does not allow him to send supplies to people in the fort. So eventually what happens is on April 12th, fighting begins at Fort Sumter. And eventually, by April 14th, the Union has to surrender the fort. Nobody dies in this fighting, which is good. That's a good thing. But because of this, and Lincoln kind of sees that the South is not just going to give up, that they're not going to talk to him either. Lincoln calls for more troops. He wants to draft more troops into the military. So that causes 4 more states to secede. And there they are: Virginia, North Carolina, Tennessee, and Arkansas. Now, one of your Confederate generals, your most famous one, Robert E. Lee, he technically was in Texas when Texas seceded. He was part of the U.S. Army. He said, I will fight with the United States for, as long as, I need to. But if my home state of Virginia secedes, I will be fighting for Virginia. So that's what happens. Robert E. Lee ends up fighting with his home state of Virginia, with his people, basically what he considered his family. So that's why Robert E. Lee ends up going on that side. If you would like to, this PowerPoint is on my website. You can go look at it. There's a cool video here that kind of shows, leading into the Civil War, kind of a preview of what's going to happen there. So if you want to, you can go back and do that. You don't have to. Let me just go ahead and give you some reminders about the coming weeks. This week, you only got 1 week of work. Next week, you'll have the option to, if you're going up to the school to get your work, you'll have the option to grab week 6 and 7 are together, and then week 8. So it's 3 weeks of work, and then you're done, which is awesome. And those 3 weeks will be available at the school if you need to go up to get them, or you can download them from my website, which they're always there. If you need a paper copy from the school, just let me know. I can let the school know and kind of prepare them, since I did kind of throw you guys off with just your 1 week. Weeks 6 and 7 are the Civil War, and it's just going to be in one packet together, but it's 10 days worth of work. And then week 8 is 6 days. So, because week 9, I'm planning to do something pretty fun with you guys. That's not packet or work related, but we wanted to make sure we got the Civil War to you guys, and then talked a little bit about Reconstruction after the Civil War. If you have any questions, remember, you can always email me, text me through Remind, things like that. So if you don't have any questions now, or if you do later, feel free to do that. But I'm going to go ahead and end the meeting. Thanks for sticking with me, y'all, and I hope I see you next week. Bye, y'all.